We now come to Lynn Brown.
Mr. Speaker, frankly it's becoming difficult to adequately express my horror at the state of this government. Every single decision seems calculated to destroy our economy, our public services, our international reputation and our environment too. This utter nonsense about fracking is another example. Truth is, there's very little prospect of fracking in West Ham, and I don't think our communities are going to be affected by consequent earthquakes or polluted water supplies. But over recent weeks, I've had loads of emails from constituents extremely concerned about the direction that the government's taking. They're worried about how the communities that could be affected, because they know how the local consent can be and is manipulated to suit agendas of the powerful. My constituents point to the constant Tory failure to prevent vile sewage pollution, and they ask why anybody would trust a government if it says that fracking wells won't destroy local water supplies. The party opposite has proven time and time again they're simply not willing or capable to stop greedy companies, whether they're privatised water utilities or frackers, from destroying our environment in the pursuit of profit. The issue of fracking is about the safety of our world and the future of our children, and so of course the people of West Ham want to have their say. They don't want us to respond to the cost of living crisis by simply increasing our dependence on the exact same technologies that destroyed it. They don't want to pretend that fracking can make a difference to energy costs, blighting our lives, because it won't. So my constituents want us to get to work on speeding up the green transition that they've been promised. They point out, quite rightly, that wind and solar power are enormously cheaper than gas, and that these technologies are getting more and more efficient with every passing year. In this place, we need a focus from government to plan, to invest and to lead partnerships with green business. We know that if we do, there will be a huge economic benefit in terms of lower energy bills and jobs in all of our communities. And if we do that, we can slash our dependence on fossil fuels from Russia and from other anti-democratic bullying states. We can't move away from that dependence, though, by extracting fossil fuels at home. There ain't enough of it. And the cost, social, economic and environmental, is way too high. And we're rapidly approaching COP27. Effectively, we are asking and expecting poor African states like the DRC to do the right thing and develop their economies with minimum amount of dirty energy. We're talking about countries who have much larger fossil reserves than us, enormously lower emissions than us, and a much higher vulnerability to climate heating than us. And we're asking them to choose a greener path to development when ministers here are shamefully speaking about extracting, and I quote, every last drop. It's madness. As an energy strategy, it will be devastating for local communities who transparently don't want it, and it drives a wrecking ball through the patient climate diplomacy that this world desperately needs.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Fracking again. To be honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, since the moment I was elected to this House, I've been speaking, I think, in probably every single debate on this subject, because for my constituents in Lancashire, this is something that really matters. It has a tangible effect on their lives, with the fracking application on Preston New Road and Rosica, in my humble friend's constituency, and it matters because of the climate emergency, which I think that we risk losing sight of if we keep focusing purely on tackling the energy crisis and cost of living crisis, as important as they are. We cannot forget that the planet is burning, and therefore all of the conversations we have around energy have to bear in mind that there is a climate emergency and that needs to be addressed. Now, for a bit of background, after I was elected in 2015, the County Council at Lancashire passed its first motion opposing fracking. That was followed 3 months later by Lancaster City Council passing a motion against fracking. And then, of course, Quadrilla get the permission, and they start fracking at Preston New Road. And at that point, we see subsequent motions objecting to fracking from councils across the county, including Lancaster City Council passing its second motion. It was clear that there was cross-party consensus and huge public dismay about fracking, which is why in 2019, during the general election, when the Conservative Party changed its policy and stood on a manifesto that pledged to ban fracking, I think there was a sense of widespread relief in our Red Rose County, because there was that cross-party consensus. The people of Lancashire thought that the issue had been put to bed. They thought that they could be safe knowing that there wasn't going to be earthquakes, safe that there wasn't going to be fracking wells littering the Foul Coast. But no, fracking is back, and we still don't want it. Local councillors of all political colours are backing motions at councils right across the county, including in this week alone one at Fylde and one at Lancashire County Council, both Tory-run councils voting unanimously to pass anti-fracking motions. And what councillors are telling me is that they do not understand what this local consent looks like. They do not know what it looks like. And I suppose my question to the Minister is, what on earth does he mean by local consent? Many people have been very concerned by the Business Secretary's comments at the Conservative Party conference, talking about fracking companies going door to door to canvass support for fracking. And I do hope that will not be included in the consultation, and I would like it if the Minister for Climate Change could rule that out in his closing remarks to this debate. The people of Lancashire don't want to have fracking forced upon them. Yes, we live in tough times. Yes, the energy bills are going up, but fracking will not solve the energy security or the price issues in the UK currently faces. We need to see the government putting far more energy into looking at energy reduction, home insulation, and frankly, the only viable long-term route to lower bills and energy security is to get off fossil fuels. Unfortunately for the Minister, the answer's staring us clear in the face, because clean energy like solar, wind, tidal, hydrogen and nuclear are all options which this government should be throwing its full weight behind. And it's why the last Labour leadership at Lancaster City Council led the way installing solar panels on public buildings like our Saltaire Sports Centre. It's why the big employers in my constituency like Lancaster University are seeking permission for more wind turbines. It's why local businesses like Nanosun in Lancaster are looking to harness hydrogen, and why the nuclear power stations at Heysham 1 and 2 provide my constituents with thousands of jobs. Lancashire will play its part with enthusiasm in a green energy revolution. We know it makes sense when solar and wind power, for example, are 9 times cheaper than gas, but fracking, no thanks. Fracking is expensive, it's unsafe, and we know that communities in Lancashire do not support it.
Okay, I'm very grateful. So why on earth would the government seek to perform another manifesto U-turn and support fracking, which their amendment does, effectively lifts the moratorium on fracking? There are 2 reasons which are stated. One is an attempt to drive down energy prices, the other is to tackle security of supply. Those are 2 massive issues, enormous energy poverty in my constituency in Cumbria, and everybody rightly worried about the lack of energy security given particularly the evil actions of President Putin. But if those were the real reasons, you wouldn't pick fracking. And I'm absolutely astounded and bemused as to why they have. The Right Honourable Member for Spelthorne, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, stated that it would not materially affect the market price for gas. That's obvious. So that's pricing out of the window. The fracking industry lobby, the lobby group, says that shale gas would contribute less than 1% of Britain's gas needs. And the British Geological Survey says that shale gas under the United Kingdom contributes 15 times less in volume than was originally thought. So it will have no impact on price, and it will do nothing meaningful when it comes to volume. So what it will do is add another fossil fuel into the mix at a time when we should be keeping all the fossil fuels in the ground, because of all the threats that we face as a country and as a community. Climate change is undoubtedly the greatest. Fossil fuels should be kept in the ground. It will also create massive seismic risks. The northwest of England, Cumbria and Lancashire, 2 of the most geologically active places in the country. Fracking is madness. Using and opting for fracking is divisive and expensive, whereas renewables are popular and cheap.
On that point,
happily, yeah.
I've again and again, Madam Speaker, gone on about green energy and hydrogen creation. Hydrogen is green and clean. We've got to get serious about this. And will the member agree with me that it's vital that all the governments in the United Kingdom work together fast and now?
I think green hydrogen is absolutely an essential part of the mix, and I agree with my honourable friend. If the government was trying to change policy quickly in order to do something that would radically make a difference quickly, then they will be opting for renewables. The United Kingdom after Canada, has the highest tidal range on planet Earth, and yet we are tapping nearly none of it. Why are we not investing in wind, in solar, allowing farmers to diversify it and to be part of the happily give way? Yes.
Just popped up. It's very generous with your time, by the way, but I wonder if you can recall when your leader says, "I love shale gas. It is much cleaner than coal, and we need more gas. I hope we get loads of it."
Yes.
My leader, when he was, of course, Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, was responsible for the United Kingdom increasing renewables by 20% every year, which dropped by 3% when he left office. And if he's concerned about leaders changing their mind, the party opposite is led by someone with more flip-flops than Benidorm. So we are not going to take any lessons from that side of the House. So renewables are the answer. They are quick and they are popular. My concern is that why on earth would a government, why on earth, no, there are other people who need to get in, and the Minister needs to be patient and wait his turn. Because my concern in all this is, what does this say about the government? It is not rational to choose shale gas and fracking at a time when it is obvious it will not have an impact on reducing prices or improve energy security, when instead the government could be moving towards tidal, marine, hydro, wind and solar. Not rational. But what is also not rational is the fact that earlier this day, the Right Honourable Member for Calder Valley, the government chief whip, wrote to every Conservative MP saying that this matter is not about fracking, it is a matter of confidence. And this causes a great problem for members opposite. They either have to vote to end the moratorium on fracking, which is enormously unpopular. Only 19% of the British people support fracking. The overwhelming majority are opposed to it, including in my constituency. So they've either got to support fracking or they've got to vote to bring down the government. That is an irrational thing for the government to seek to put before this House. And the difficulty is we're beginning to see a pattern of irrational behaviour at the centre of our government. That if we care about our energy supplies, the cost of energy, the enormously painful cost of living that is a threat to every single family in this country, we care about those things, our economy, we cannot have people in high office and leading the government party who are acting consistently, illogically and irrationally. And this is an irrational proposal, and that is why it is right the government should give way and why we should be opposing fracking, and it's why I will be voting to oppose fracking today. I challenge members opposite to ignore their whips and vote to end fracking.
Speaker, we will not support fracking unless the science shows categorically that it can be done safely. That was the 2019 Conservative manifesto. We will only allow fracking where there is local consent. That was the Prime Minister in her leadership bid this summer. There is no new science and there is no local consent. Indeed, in July this year, the government commissioned a report, which has already been quoted today, from the British Geological Survey investigating the impact of fracking. The report showed no new science, but concluded that forecasting earthquakes as a result of fracking remains a challenge. Extracting shale gas through fracking in the hope of offsetting the energy crisis will not work. Implementing the process is expensive and returns simply not enough to make a significant difference to our energy sector. It was the member for Spelthorne that stated that fracking won't materially affect the wholesale market price. It would do nothing to cut bills, costing far more than renewables, and it is unsafe. Even the founder of the fracking company Quadrilla has stated that fracking is not safe nor viable in the UK. It is clear to see that nobody in the UK other than the government wants this plan to go ahead. Given that the 50% of the last round of fracking licences were in Yorkshire, people in Barnsley are concerned about the government's disastrous plans to reintroduce fracking. Only 17% of the public support the practice. The Business Secretary claims he would be happy to allow fracking in his back garden, but he does not speak for the rest of the country, and he certainly does not speak for the people of Barnsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would just like to remind members why we're here today. The site on Prestonview Road rocked houses, damaged communities and terrified residents. And quite not just on one occasion, 2 or 3 occasions, and quite rightly the Conservative government put a ban on fracking until it could be convinced that it could be safely drilled out and caused little disruption to the communities. The Prime Minister was on Radio Lancashire, and we've got a very good host, Graham Liver, and I'd just like to congratulate him on his wedding split. But Graham cornered the Prime Minister with the first 30 seconds when he said, "What has changed?" She did not have an answer. And he asked 3 or 4 times, and she still couldn't answer. She just kept saying she was very clear that people would be consulted. He asked her, what does that consultation look like? She didn't know. So members on the opposite side to accuse this side of taking the order paper is an absolute joke. Your government put in the ban. Your government says the ban would not be lifted.
Order. It's not your government. It's their government.
The government put in the ban. The government said it would lift that ban when there was safety assured. That's not happened. So you can play politics and find an excuse to vote against your conscience, but don't blame people on this side. I do not support fracking. Lancashire does not support fracking, and the government has failed to deliver any assurance that it was safe. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Until recently, the debate on climate change was about the science and whether or not global heating is caused by humans. But it's important to say that while the climate deniers argued over the science and the hockey stick graphs, that wasn't what gave momentum to their arguments. To be clear, there has been long, overwhelming evidence that human CO2 emissions are causing global heating. The motor of climate denial was never a rational, scientific debate, but defending the financial interests of the fossil fuel lobby. Pseudo-scientific arguments were the only form that they have of defence of their arguments, and that's the defence that they took. Now, after decades of campaigning, protesting and lobbying, the monumental efforts of climate campaigners have meant it's politically very difficult to deny the reality of the climate emergency. The overwhelming scientific evidence has been joined by the international grassroots political movement calling for climate justice. So now we're seeing a different strategy for protecting oil and gas profits. We're now being asked to choose between tackling the cost of living crisis or the climate emergency, between energy security and meeting our Paris obligations. The decision to reverse fracking is part of that new strategy, a very cynical strategy. It's an argument that says black is white, that up is down, and that pulling more fossil fuels out of the ground is somehow a form of environmentalism. But it's an argument we should completely reject, because it is nonsense. The twin ecological and climate emergency are two of the greatest existential threats we face. They demand that we restore our natural environment, keep fossil fuels in the ground, and make a transition to clean, renewable energy. Fracking takes us in exactly the opposite direction. The CCC warned that if the moratorium should be lifted, it should absolutely not be lifted without an independent review of the evidence on the climate impact. Has that been done? No, of course it's not been done. The process produces methane, which also contributes to the rising global temperatures. Research by NASA has shown that leaky gas production is one of the main drivers of methane emissions on the planet. In fact, during 1 week alone in a site in Lancashire in 2019, 4.2 tonnes of methane were released, equivalent to 142 flights. Extracting shale gas is also environmentally damaging. The geography of the UK means that it's more likely to cause earthquakes and the chemical flowback and waters being significantly at risk of contamination and further significant ecological damage. And none of this will lower our energy bills or increase our energy security. That's because gas prices aren't set by domestic supply, but the international fossil fuel markets. Even if domestic production did significantly affect international prices, the wells here would not make a difference to those prices. It's a falsehood.
Anna McMorran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The fight against climate change is one that everyone but this government seems to be deeply worried about. In Wales, We are proud that our Welsh Labour government remains absolutely steadfast in our fracking ban, which has been in place for 7 years now and will continue. So it's even more disturbing that this Prime Minister, absent of a public mandate, has decided to tear up her own party's 2019 manifesto and any hopes of a stable future by bringing back fracking. And is it any surprise when this government is imploding? Is the Secretary of State even going to be here tomorrow? It is heartening, though, to see members on the opposite side publicly declare their support for us and against this government's option on Twitter, coming out one at a time, particularly the member for Kingswood, who is also chair of the government's Net Zero review. I think that is quite telling. This energy crisis is costing lives. Action absolutely needs to be taken to curb more suffering, but fracking is not the answer. It makes it worse. And this crisis has been created by an over-reliance on oil and gas. We can't increase it, and this government refuses to understand that. You can't tackle one crisis without tackling the other, but instead, this government has chosen to ignore the warnings, the science, and pleas, making a deliberate attack, not only on the environment, but public health too. In England alone, a third of drinking water is supplied by groundwater. The British Geological Survey stated that groundwater can be contaminated by fracking. One concerning risk is from flowback water coming from fracking itself. Water that flows back contains high concentration of saline, known to cause hypertension, which can lead to pregnant women developing preeclampsia, exposing the mother to potential stroke risk, organ failure, with some babies being stillborn. Medical experts have written to the British Medical Journal stating these arguments. And in complete contrast, this government's own climate minister has claimed it's good for the environment. But that same minister publicly published his support for the ban of March this year. Fracking won't solve any of our energy problems, and it won't provide the essential support the country needs right now. Drilling is irrelevant to this energy crisis, let alone being a complete abdication of duty to the environment, local communities and the climate. This latest move drives a cart and horses through any chance of credibility on global leadership on climate. They must keep that ban now.
Yeah.
Grant Davies.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we're here because the previous Chancellor lifted the moratorium on fracking, and his previous boss, Crispin Oddy of Oddy Hedge Fund, has put millions and millions of pounds of investment into fracking now. He's the same one who made hundreds of millions of pounds when the pound went down following Brexit, having supported Leave. He's the same one who made a lot of money out of sterling going down after the mini budget. Strange, isn't it? So we've got a situation now, the government's lifted the moratorium, saying you can go ahead with fracking so long as you have safety and a local consent, so maybe that will be bribed. We don't know what will happen there. But I don't think that's sufficient, because we need to think about the environment. I was rapporteur for the Council of Europe on fracking, and what we found from satellite data was that 5% of the methane being pulled up was actually leaked through fugitive emissions, which meant that fracking is worse than coal for global warming, because methane is 80 times worse than CO2. And so we recommended 46 countries that no one went ahead with fracking. As a result, Macron, when he was first elected, he didn't have many policies. He took that policy off the table and he banned fracking, as we have, in fact, in Wales. Of course, fracking consists of sending millions of tons, millions of cubic metres of a chemically impregnated water, often hundreds of chemicals, which are carcinogenic, into the ground. Half of them come back, half of them stay underneath so they can contaminate the water table. The rest have to be processed. In the United States, they dump them in Arizona. Well, we're not the United States and we haven't got the space. We've got the lorries running around the countryside, smashing up our environment. We've got mini earthquakes causing disturbances. We've got air quality quality data from the United States showing local people have all runny eyes, all sorts of problems. And as I say, that's why in Wales we've also banned it. We're focusing on tidal lagoons, wind farms, solar energy, spatial planning. There is a way forward for a sustainable green energy future. The answer is not fracking. It's environmentally unsound. We should dismiss it even if there was consent, even if there was safety concerns were alleviated, which they won't be. This is absolutely appalling. This is Tory fracking, and people should vote Labour because of this appalling decision to lift the moratorium.
Madam Deputy Speaker, fracking will not solve the energy crisis. Indeed, the shale gas extracted by fracking would make no difference to gas prices and is a more expensive alternative to renewables. Further, fracking would demonstrably increase the risk of local earth tremors, as recently confirmed by the British Geological Survey. And on the wider environmental impact, Greenpeace state that not only is fracking bad for our climate, it risks causing air, water and noise pollution. It uses toxic chemicals that may not be regulated well enough. An accident could mean that these chemicals leak into water supplies or cause pollution above ground. In fact, this has happened many times in the US. So why on earth, with all of this in mind, would the government pursue a strategy that poses such risks and flies in the face of efforts to tackle climate change? Well, author and climate commentator Naomi Klein calls it the shock doctrine. The exploitation of wrenching crises to smuggle through policies that devour the public sphere and further enrich a small elite. But the bandit capitalism extends beyond just fracking into the way the government approaches our whole energy system. The pursuit of markets at all costs with little state intervention keeps leading to the same problems. Complex, poorly designed mechanisms open to gaming and profiteering that deliver poor value for money if they deliver at all, and poor environmental outcomes. And when that system fails, as it is doing now, well, it's everybody else's problem. Now, there's a new generation calling for change, a Green New Deal, a green jobs revolution that would distribute costs and rewards progressively, deepen economic democracy and kickstart an industrial strategy to rebuild and light up Britain. On this side of the House, we get that. But I'm worried that we'll miss this chance. Worse though, I'm actually frightened. Frightened that whilst there are numerous colleagues on the benches opposite who may speak out against fracking, the fact remains that they are still in the government led by an environmental and economic vandal. And although the clock may well be ticking on the Prime Minister's days in office, as Naomi Klein sadly states, when powerful ideologies are challenged by hard evidence from the real world, they rarely die off completely. A few true believers always remain to tell one another that the problem wasn't the ideology, it was the weakness of the leaders who did not apply the rules with sufficient rigour. So that is why today is so important. That's why across this House we have a moral duty to vote in favour of this motion to introduce a bin to ban hydraulic fracking for shale gas once and for all.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government must ban fracking once and for all. It's dangerous, it's outdated, dangerous and expensive way to produce energy, and it will not provide the clean, secure energy that our country needs, nor will it help us meet our legally binding commitment to net zero. As Friends of the Earth have pointed out, fracking risks contaminating water, it poses risk to public health and the environment, and is unlikely to reduce energy bills. The government's written statement of November 2019 said that the moratorium on fracking would be maintained until compelling new evidence is provided which addresses the concerns around the prediction and management of induced seismicity. Likewise, the Conservative Party manifesto of 2019, on which members opposite stood and were elected, said, "We will not support fracking unless the science shows categorically that it can be done safely." Nothing has changed, and I ask the Minister to explain what he thinks has. The recent report by the British Geological Survey found that forecasting the occurrence of large earthquakes and their expected magnitude remains a significant challenge for the geoscience community. Recently, the Secretary of State said that tolerating a higher degree of risk and disturbance appears to us to be in the national interest. So it appears that we have, as well as being reckless with the economy, the government is being reckless with the environment and the health and safety of our communities. The Committee on Climate Change has made it clear that moving away from fossil fuel consumption will both benefit households, as it will reduce exposure to volatile fossil fuel prices and reduce emissions. The government speaks of consent, but it's a matter of very real concern that there are reports that households could be handed £1,000 to consent to fracking in their area. Greenpeace has quite rightly labelled this as a cynical ploy and said that the government must be hoping that they can buy off people's concerns while they're struggling with the cost of living crisis. There currently exists a Petroleum Exploration and Development Licence, PEDL 184, covering an area of North West England, which includes my constituency of Wirral West. The licence allows a company to pursue a range of oil and gas exploration activities, subject to necessarily drilling and development consents and planning permission. No wonder my constituents are worried. They have made it abundantly clear that they do not want to see fracking. We on these benches will stand up for our constituents today and oppose fracking. The members opposite should stand by their manifesto commitment and do the same.
Justin Matters.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, can I start with words from the Conservative Party manifesto, page 55, because it's very clear and it's there in black and white. We placed a moratorium on fracking in England with immediate effect. Having listened to local communities, we have ruled out changes to the planning system. We will not support fracking unless the science shows categorically that it can be done safely. I read those words out because they should mean something. They should mean something to all of those opposite who were elected on those words. And if they don't mean anything to them, I'm sure they will mean something to the people who voted them in here as well, and who will be watching very closely how they vote today, because the science hasn't categorically shown that it can be done safely. But I'd also like to thank the Tory whips, actually, for making this a confidence vote in the Prime Minister, because after the week that she has had, I think that is more likely to lead to backbenchers voting with us than against us. But if they're not persuaded by that, please don't fall for the spin that we've heard that we need to do this to deal with the rising cost of energy, because it was not so long ago that the now former Chancellor said that those calling for the return of fracking misunderstand the situation. And he also said that if we lifted the fracking moratorium, it would take up to a decade to extract sufficient volumes, and it would come at a high cost for communities on our precious countryside. No amount of shale gas from hundreds of wells dotted across rural England would be enough to lower the European price anytime soon. And with the best will in the world, private companies are not going to sell the shale gas they produce to UK consumers below the market price. They are not charities, after all. Well, even a stop clock is right twice a day, and it's even the case that a discredited former Chancellor can be right about something, and he was certainly right about that. I just finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, say a few words about consent. The dictionary definition of consent is permission to do something or an agreement to do something. So let's be clear that that is not the same as getting a payment in lieu of consent, and it does not mean having a refined planning process to create the illusion of consent. And I'm afraid the government amendment doesn't really take us to a place where I am convinced that we will have genuine consent, and whatever is said from the dispatch box doesn't really mean anything when cabinet ministers are falling on a daily basis. Because let's be clear, consent is not the same as consultation, and this amendment talks too much about consultation rather than consent. Consultation is not as robust, it's not as definitive, and it's certainly not what people would expect. And the Business Secretary said last month that compensation and consent become two sides of the same coin. Well, I would say that they cannot possibly be two sides of the same coin. Compensation is payment in recognition of a loss. That does not in any way mean that people have agreed to suffer that loss. And if the government really do want to get consent for fracking the countryside, they should put it in their manifesto and call a general election, and we'll see whether they do get that consent.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to be called to speak in this debate today, which I believe the whips opposite have called a confidence motion in the Prime Minister. I don't know which is more exciting for her to receive her P45. Is it our side or theirs which is more exciting? The Prime Minister promised that fracking will take place only in areas with a clear public consensus behind it. But the Business Secretary ruled out local referendums and suggested that fracking companies themselves could go round door to door and ask people if they will consent. Aside from this being a truly ridiculous idea, appointing fracking operators as the arbiters of local consent would create an obvious conflict of interest and would undermine the authority of democratically elected councils. If the Business Secretary is so keen to start digging up people's areas and causing earthquakes, I look forward to the government's newer site opening in North East Somerset in the coming weeks. It may surprise some, but I agree with many of the members opposite. The member for Fylde spoke passionately last week and again today in regards to constituents who were labelled as Luddites by the Business Secretary. When I was a county councillor in Lancashire when this was actually debated over 7 years ago, and also now as the Member of Parliament for Bury South, I know the people of Radcliffe, Whitefield and Prestwich certainly aren't Luddites either, and neither are the people of Lancashire.
Hear, hear.
I am against fracking, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's unpopular, it industrialises the countryside, and it contributes to climate breakdown, and importantly, fails to address the energy crisis. But it's not just me who thinks that, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's the public too. One person said it would take up to a decade to extract what we need by fracking, and that it was pointless. That was the Chancellor of last week. It will create enormous disruption for little economic gain. That was the Chancellor of this week, 4 months ago. The Defence Secretary opposed proposals for a fracking site in his constituency. The Tory party chair signed the Defence Secretary's letter opposing fracking. The Leving Up Secretary said there isn't strong support for fracking, and I agree. The Secretary of State for DCMS didn't want it in her backyard, and I don't blame her. So now we know that her cabinet don't have faith in fracking, or her. I look forward to many of the members opposite joining me in the lobbies today.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today we've heard from colleagues across the House making clear their opposition to fracking. It was particularly powerful hearing from MPs from the Lancashire area, which has already been affected by the seismic shocks of previous drilling, and their constituents live in fear of that happening again. Fracking is dangerous, polluting, and will not provide energy security for this country, and it is deeply unpopular. The government finally seemed to get that in 2019 with its manifesto commitment to a fracking ban, and as it's been said, everyone on that side of the House stood on that manifesto and made that promise to their constituents. Yet it's only taken a matter of days for this new administration to bring fracking back. And not through a vote or a consultation or a debate in this House. It was a decision taken just by the Secretary of State alone, who's not even turned up to hear the winding up speeches. No scrutiny, the Secretary of State, no scrutiny and no accountability. Oh, sorry, I didn't see him there. Their manifesto promised the ban on fracking would remain in place until evidence categorically proved it was safe. But the recent report from the British Geological Survey commissioned by the government has offered no new evidence whatsoever to suggest the situation has changed. As the Honourable Member for Fylde said, the geology hasn't changed. How could it? The science hasn't changed either. So what did the Secretary of State do when he couldn't find the evidence he wanted? He decided to change the rules on how big an earthquake can be considered safe. I would laugh, Madam Deputy Speaker, but there's nothing funny about this. Labour has been absolutely clear that we will always oppose fracking, whether in opposition or in government. And I'm proud that the Labour government in Wales is keeping the ban. And let us not forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this reckless decision comes in the middle of a climate emergency. At COP26, this government made a commitment on the world stage to prioritise the clean energy transition and end public support for the fossil fuel sector by the end of 2022. So how's that going? A year on, and they're not just bringing back fracking for gas, they're also issuing hundreds of new licences for fossil fuel extraction. No wonder the Prime Minister is trying to wriggle out of attending COP in Egypt next month. Let's call this what it is. It's climate vandalism. The decisions of this government are undermining our climate targets and trashing our reputation on the global stage. As the Honourable Member for West Ham said, it's taken a wrecking ball to years of patient climate diplomacy, and I'm sure the COP President would have something to say about that. The Minister for Climate Change, who's replying to the debate today, may be willing to swallow his pride and to claim that fracking is green in exchange for a seat down the far end of the cabinet table. But on this side of the House, we will be honest about fossil fuels. They are expensive, they're polluting our air and they're destroying our planet. As my right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster North, made clear earlier, the only solution to the energy crisis is a green one. Madam Deputy Speaker, removing a ban on fracking shows that we cannot trust a Tory promise, even if it was embedded in their manifesto. So how can we trust what is being said today about ensuring local consent? And let's be clear, the amendment doesn't say there will be a veto, it doesn't explain how that consent would be obtained, it's very weak on the detail, and it doesn't promise a binding vote on this House on what that consent would look like. And as my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, said, why do we even need to do this? We know that polling, the government's own polling, shows that only 17% of people support fracking. And I would imagine a large proportion of those that will say, but not in my backyard. We're quite happy for it to, I think a Lord's Minister once said, in the desolate north, that's where you would frack. I'm sure that the government committing to a ban on fracking today and committing to bringing forward their own bill if they don't want Labour to put the seize control of the order paper would come as a great relief to many of the government's own MPs. Our message to colleagues on the opposite benches is this. Fracking is not necessary, it is not wanted, and it is not inevitable. Each of you there today on the opposition benches have a chance to, on the opposite benches, I should say, have a chance to, yeah, I'm forward thinking on my part. Each of you have a chance today to ensure the voices of your constituents are heard and that our planet is protected. If you support our motion today, we will secure a binding vote on a bill to ban fracking on the 29th of November, in the absence of any willingness from the government to bring that forward itself. You will all have the opportunity to ban fracking before a single drill starts up in your constituencies. You know that's what your constituents want you to do.
That's your only problem, is it?
They know that there's no excuse for doing it. So do the right thing and support the Labour motion today.